Well, greetings, friends, and welcome. And we're continuing our series on Jesus and a lot of things: history, mental health, other religions. In the other religions category, the most important one, clearly to parse, is Judaism. Jesus was Jewish, so in Bible, like that matters. But then also through history, Jesus and Christianity's relationship to Judaism has been a huge problem through history. So I thought about thinking about Jesus and Judaism today, that I would bring in my friend, a previous guest on this program that everybody just loves. She's always so informative, inspiring, Amy Jo Levine. AJ, thank you for joining us.
Oh, James, always a pleasure.
Always good to see you. We were in school at Duke together back in the day and stayed in touch over the years, and it's been good to connect with you in this way. So that's a great thing. So with Jesus and Judaism, let me just start with this. I know one other time I asked you about, how does a Jewish person become a scholar of Jesus and the New Testament? I want to ask that a little bit differently now. So when I was in school, some of my Christian theology professors loved to quote Saint Athanasius, who said, "If you really want to understand Scripture, you got to be living the Christian life and faith. You've got to be worshiping, praying, and so on." So I wonder what you make of that. And I wonder, actually, though, contrary to Athanasius, is there some advantage to being Jewish in terms of reading the New Testament and understanding Jesus?
It's an interesting question. I'd first want to go back and parse your Jesus and. The question is not Jesus and Judaism. The real question is Jesus and Christianity. Because the Christianity that Athanasius was proclaiming, including debates over the canon, were not things that Jesus was particularly worried about. So it's not so much Jesus and Judaism, it's Jesus is a Jew. And then we have to figure out what all that means. Does it give one an advantage if one in the 21st century is a Jew to look back on the first century? Not so much. Because we're not living in the first century any more than does it give you an advantage if you're a Christian to try to figure out what's going on, in Corinth when Paul is writing about meat offered to idols. Probably not so much. So the work that one does in Jesus and Judaism, or Jesus within Judaism, which is probably a better way of framing it, is not based on contemporary sensibilities or contemporary practice, but it may have something to do with being particularly interested in recovering one's own history and then trying to be as objective about it as possible, which of course is impossible.
I mean, you've helped me personally in your writings, because one of the things that you help, I think, Christian interpreters to see is the way, sort of unwittingly, there's some lines of interpretation that really are anti-Semitic, that really misunderstand what Judaism is about. So, oh yeah, those Jews were legalistic, but Jesus is a guy of grace. Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And you've really helped, I think, for those who are paying attention in the Christian world, to parse that a little bit better.
Sure. If you have to make Judaism look bad to make Jesus look good, something has gone really wrong with your theology.
Yeah, so Jesus, to me, this seems so obvious. Jesus was Jewish. To talk about his relationship to being Jewish, it's like asking me, what's your relationship to being a white guy? I am a white guy. I don't know. So Jesus was Jewish. I mean, talk about that. Was he unusual in his way of being?
Do you mean like was he a marginal Jew, as John Meyer has put? No, he's a perfectly normal Jew, probably more charismatic than most. I think he's a healer and an exorcist, which, it's not every Jew in the first century went to medical school. So I think that's certainly distinctive. He's interested in alternative family relations, like who are my mother and brothers and sisters, and it's not, like the natal family. It's the people who are sitting around him. That seems very similar to what's going on with the people who composed the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Philo of Alexandria, who's this Jewish philosopher living in Egypt. He talks about a group called the Therapeutai, who look like Jewish Shakers. But there are these, alternative family systems that we're having at the time. So I think he makes perfectly good sense within his own first century context. He has to, because otherwise other Jews would have looked at him and said, what? He's got to make enough sense for people to be interested in what he has to say and to take him seriously, which they do, and to debate with him, which they do. But is he against Torah? To the contrary, he makes Torah more rigorous. Is he against the prophets? No, he takes his cue from the prophets and preaches messages of justice, just like they did to Jews who had heard those messages before. So yeah, he makes perfect sense in his own context.
I mean, he was a rabbi. He gets called rabbi.
Yeah, well, rabbi just basically has a sense of teacher, which is how the New Testament glosses it. So when you get somebody calling him rabbi, you get this little Aramaic, Rabbuni, this little Aramaic dropped in. The New Testament then comes in and says basically, which means teacher, didaskalos. He's not a rabbi like the rabbis of the Talmud are rabbis. Um, he's not part of a rabbinic group. The rabbis tend to do things with other rabbis and debate with other rabbis. Jesus doesn't. Because the rabbinic movement, as we know it, really took shape after the destruction of the temple in 70, and Jesus is living before that.
I mean, would we say Jesus was I've heard this, a reformer within Judaism? He felt Judaism had gone astray, lost some of its identity.
Yeah, I think that comes from hooking up Jesus with Martin Luther. And it's a Protestant move, and it's sort of like Luther didn't like the Catholic Church because it was legalistic and ritualistic and hierarchical, and Jesus didn't like Judaism because it was ritualistic, blah blah blah. So all that reformer language tends to do is get you a Protestant Jesus and get you a Roman Catholic Judaism, and it's not a helpful move. It's an apologetic move. So if you talk about Jesus as a reformer, then you have to figure out what it is that he's trying to reform. And that's not clear to me. He is trying to get people to practice Torah the way he thinks Torah ought to be practiced. John the Baptist was doing the same thing, and the Pharisees were doing the same thing, and the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls were doing the same thing. It's kind of like it's not entirely like, but it's kind of like looking at the United States when people look at the Constitution and say, what does the Second Amendment mean? How far can we push a certain law, or what rights do transgender people have based on equality things? And different people come up with different reasons. And then you have these debates. But I don't think reform is quite the right reading on that.
I guess, did so many lay people, it's almost like Jesus came along to create a new religion, like quit being Jewish, we'll be Christian now. Jesus is the first Christian, maybe his mother, I don't know. That can't be right. But why then, though, was there a split? There wasn't a split during the life of Jesus. It was after the death of Jesus when there came to be a split. Why did that happen?
Well, the split in any sort of formal sense doesn't happen for another couple of hundred years. So that Jews who are followers of Jesus still consider themselves Jews. Paul certainly does. As he tells us in Philippians, he's as to the law, Pharisee, born of the tribe of Benjamin, an Israelite. And Paul trots all that stuff, even though Paul keeps saying, I'm not boasting, he's boasting. Because he didn't trot all that stuff out if he didn't think it was important. And that's how he shows how much more important the Christ is. But the Christ is even more important than all that stuff. It's like saying you and I got PhDs from Duke, but there's stuff that's more important than that. You don't trot out your credentials unless you want to one-up something. So you've got Jerome, St. Jerome, who talks about this group called the Nazareans. And he says, well, they follow Torah, they follow Jewish law, so the church doesn't want them. And they worship Jesus, so the synagogue doesn't want them. So toss them out. But they think they're Jews. They haven't given up their Jewish identity. So when you think about Judaism, part of the problem that we have today is that we today tend to think about Judaism as a religion like Christianity. In other words, Judaism is a faith community. That's a Christian term. Jews are part of a people. The Greek would be ethnos, Germans are part of a people, or Irish are part of a people, or Kenyans are part of a people. So you can be Jewish no matter what you believe, in the same way you can be an American no matter what you believe. Because at the end of the day, you're still part of that ethnic group. And even when we get to the rabbinic period and Jews start talking about heresy, there still are heretics, and we're still talking with them, and we're still quoting them, because you really can't throw them out.
I'm semi-relieved, I think, that we're not doing this in front of a crowd, because I've done some programs in churches in front of, I guess, Christian people with particularly rabbi friends here in Charlotte. And something weird always happens, always. So years ago, the first time I ever did this, Rabbi Jim Bennett was with me, and we did this Jim loved to do the "we're really the same." we really agree. And that was fun. He was succeeded by Rabbi Murray Ezra, who loved to say, we really disagree. How could you people think something so stupid? Which I like that better. It was fun. Anyway, inevitably, we'd present whatever we presented, and there'd be a Q&A time. So with Jim Bennett, the first time, it's quiet. And the voice from the back of the room says, what about the virgin birth? I turned around. I didn't know this person. And I said it out loud. I said, I don't know that person. Just rude and obnoxious. But almost always we have people in Charlotte, they call themselves something like Messianic Christians or something.
Yes.
They come to these events and they raise their hand and they ask me, why aren't you trying to convert him, the rabbi?
Yeah.
What is that anxiety on your side? What is that anxiety about, do you think?
I can tell you. There are various groups of Messianic Jews because, just as there are different groups of Jews, Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and then they disagree with each other. Reform, it's reform, not reformed, right? Reformed are Presbyterians. Reconstructionist Jews, conservative Jews, and so on. So my synagogue is called Modern Orthodox. So in the same way that Jews today don't agree, the same way that Christians today don't agree, I mean, Methodists are not the same thing as Baptists, although from the outside, and they're not the same thing as Episcopalians and so on, although there were connections. So there were groups of Messianic Jews who go under the label of post-missionary Messianic Judaism, PMMJ, and they're not in favor of Jews evangelizing other Jews. They simply say, we're Jews. We are practicing Jews in terms of diet and dress and Sabbath observance and so on. But we also worship Jesus as Savior. So we want to be part of that Jewish group. But we don't think, we already believe that Jews are under covenant. That doesn't go away. So all we want to do is say if Jews feel that they've been called by the Christ, they want to be considered still part of Judaism. There are other Jews who usually go under the label Jews for Jesus, who insist that Jews need the Christ in order to be, and here the language varies from fulfilled or perfected. And they're very upset when their fellow Messianics who are not interested in evangelism and when Christians who are not interested in evangelizing Jews say, no, Jews are still under covenant, just let them go. And these Messianic Jews are saying, no, you have to bring them the good news of Jesus because that's the fulfillment of their own tradition. Now, this is no different than what you have in mainstream Christianity, where you have some branches of Christianity that say, basically, leave the Jews alone. They're under covenant with God. We can do social justice work with them, but we're not going to hawk Jesus on them because God will take care of it, at the end of time. And there are other Christian groups that have money dedicated to go evangelize Jews, which is really actually not a very good use of the money because the yield is not good given cost-benefit analysis. So you've got some Jews who worship Jesus, but they want to retain their Jewish identity. You have other Jews who worship Jesus who convert to some form of Christianity, and they may identify ethnically as Jews, but religiously as Methodists or Episcopalians or Roman Catholics or whatnot. And you've got some Jews who worship Jesus who debate whether Jews should be evangelized or not. Why should Jews be any more organized than greater Christianity? And the answer is they're not, and there's no reason they should be.
That's amazing. Well said. There's anti-Semitic stuff in the New Testament.
I don't think so.
Okay, let's talk about this. So the later Christians, did they make this up? Did Luther make it up? Or did they misunderstand not just Jesus, but what the New Testament was about? In the same way, I just finished reading a book by my friend Vernon Burton about the U.S. Constitution and race. And what's hilarious, it's not funny at all, really, to read the judgments the Supreme Court made reading our Constitution in the early 1800s in mean, awful way. Anyway, is there anti-Semitic stuff? Is there not? Daniel Silva, a great novelist, he has this fairly new novel called The Order. And he spends a lot of time on the 7 words, right, where Jesus is on trial and the Jews say, his blood be on us and on our children. He thinks that's created all this havoc through the centuries.
Well, he's right. That's Matthew 27:25. Is it anti-Semitic? Well, part of this, you have to parse out what you mean by language. I mean, which is something academics do when it's annoying, but sometimes it's helpful. Anti-Semitism is typically looked at as a racial concern. Like the Nazis are anti-Semite. The Nazis didn't care what you believed. If you had one Jewish grandmother or grandfather, that was it. You were a Jew, and therefore you were destined for destruction. The New Testament thinks if you're a Jew and you believe in Jesus, you're just peachy. So it's not a racial thing. But does the New Testament have anti-Judaism, or more simply put, Jew hatred? I think so. And that becomes, as you pointed out, a matter of interpretation. So how we read the Constitution, you can read it in a very malevolent manner, a hateful manner. And you can read the same text in a very justice-oriented, of course, it depends upon who's defining the justice. You can read it in a kind and compassionate way. And the same thing happens with the New Testament. So if you take that blood cry, that's the technical term for that in Matthew, where the people say in Greek, starosite, starosite, crucify him, his blood be on us and on our children. There are some readers, Christian readers, who say, oh, that's the Jews accepting that the blood of Jesus grants forgiveness. And ironically, they're recognizing the messianic benefits of the death of the Christ. And there are other people who are saying, oh, no, what this text means is, Matthew says, all the people, the Greek is pasolos, all the people cry this out. That this is really all those people who still identify as Jews saying, yes, we're responsible from today and on through the generations for killing Jesus, and we don't care about it. So much depends upon how you want to read the text. We can try to figure out what Matthew intended, which may not be the same thing as what Matthew's readers thought, because there's always slippage between what you say and what somebody hears. And then we can look at how that text has been interpreted over time. So we're stuck here. And now we need Christian theologians to come in and say, interpret it in a kind way rather than in a nasty way, which Christian theologians have done. That is, by the way, James, the limits of the historical critical method of biblical studies, is we really don't know what Matthew had in mind. The best we can do is guess.
Yeah, and I would say, why read it not in a malevolent way, but in a generous way? I would say that's not kind of modern liberalism, but really that's at the heart of what all the Bible is about. Anyhow, if you, I think, try to read what's at the heart of all of that, it's not let's be malevolent toward other people, but let's find.
Yeah, except for most of Christendom, it took World War II and the atrocities of the Nazis to come to the realization that, oh gosh, the traditional way people have been reading these texts is actually not so good. And it's not just that one verse, it's an entire package. So even when you get to some historical biblical criticism in the 19th century, where people are actually looking and saying, what is going on here? There was a general view that, well, the Jews just rejected Jesus. And since it was so obvious that he was right, therefore it's so obvious that there's something wrong with Jews. You didn't have to go that way. You could have read with Paul and say that a hardening has come upon Israel, this is Romans, until all the Gentiles come in. So it's not the Jews' fault. Just leave them alone. They're under God's protection. And eventually, as Paul puts it in Romans 11, all Israel will be saved, by which I think Paul means, ethnic Jews. But that's not the way the church chose to read.
And Paul has doesn't he? He has a grief over the separation, the difference. He's not triumphal over it. He has tears that
my kinsmen by race, as he puts it. Yeah, my fellow Jews, and I'm really upset about that. And I'd give up whatever I had if I could bring them in. However, he also concludes that this is part of God's plan, and if asked to parse it out too much, he says it's a mystery, which is a great theological punt, but
it works every time. Yeah. So let's talk. I want to talk to, if you're willing, to talk about. We have a mutual friend named Ben Witherington, and Ben's been in this series. He's a child of our church. He has history. I had his father's funeral. His mom died right before Christmas, and you and Ben have been good friends, and you've actually collaborated on some projects. I have a commentary on the Gospel of Luke. This is the lectionary reading for Christians during this year. Luke. I hope everyone will read your commentary.
Oh, amen.
And so you and Ben wrote a commentary on Luke, and I love the way it's just kind of talking. You can't tell who's who, but then sometimes it's like, Amy Jill thinks this, but Ben thinks this. Talk about that. What's that conversation like? Why does that matter? Why is that a good sort of thing to engage in?
Oh, that's such a good question. I love Ben. Ben has been a dear friend for decades. And this was actually Ben's idea. He said, let's write a commentary together. And I went, how's this going to work? And he said, well, when we disagree, we can say so. And when we agree, we can say that too. And part of the idea was biblical studies, like pretty much every other discipline or anything that we do, we live in echo chambers. The various logarithms for our computers tell us, read this person because you'll agree here. And we simply get reinforced. So there's a group of people who would probably read me. Gee, I wonder what the liberal feminist Jewish New Testament writer is saying. And there are a bunch of people who are going to read Ben who are going to be thinking, what's up to date in the evangelical world in biblical studies. So the first move is to say, what would happen if people who would normally read Ben actually looked at my stuff, and people who normally read my stuff looked at Ben's stuff? That's good. We also thought it would be really helpful in this age where people can't have a conversation about anything, to model this sense of civility, to say that you can disagree on fundamental issues. And believing in Jesus as Lord and Savior, that's a fundamental issue. You can disagree on such things, and you can still be really close friends, and you can care about each other, and you can love each other. And you can wait in that tension before some sort of final verdict is in. Ben and I read history differently. We read Luke differently. Ben thinks Luke is terrific on women. I wouldn't date Luke even if it was a great steak dinner, I wouldn't go. Ben thinks Luke is really great on Jews and Judaism. I have my doubts. So, there are many things. Fundamental issues in Lucan studies in which we disagree. Ben thinks pretty much everything happened that Luke describes, if not necessarily in that order. And I think Luke threw in a lot of stuff that was important to Luke, but wasn't necessarily historical. Let's see how biblical studies works and model that for readers who never see that debate happening.
It's something about, I have a friend who says that hospitality is curiosity, right? Are you curious about another person? We live in a world that suffers from, I think, a lack of curiosity. People think they've got everything figured out. It's their political ideology. So you're right, modeling how to disagree, and even to allow that the other person's they've got a good point. This Rabbi Ezra that I would talk about, we would debate things. And to me, the most beautiful moments were we would disagree strongly, and people knew he was my best friend in the ministry.
Yeah.
So that was big. But then also sometimes he would say something, and I would say, God, and I wasn't faking it for the crowd. I would say, man, you got a good point there. And I even got him on the crucifixion of Jesus and what it means to say, I like that. That's got some appeal to me. That's sort of magical, right? If we could do that. And the divisions are always funny. Ben, dear friend, he and I disagree pretty strongly on some items of how to be Methodist. Within Christianity, we're United Methodist, and we're not of one mind, but we love each
you're united for the time being. Let's see what happens at the next general conference.
Absolutely. But we'll be friends forever. So anyhow, one last kind of oddball question, AJ. What's the latest thing you've read or learned about Jesus that's interesting to you? You know so much over time, but anything?
I've been struggling to complete a book on how do we talk about contemporary issues of dissension by looking at the Gospels. So not so much necessarily Jesus, but how do the Gospels talk about certain things like healthcare, or gender and sexuality, or politics, or slavery, which I think is really important. So I've been doing a lot of work on Jesus' parables and slavery, Jesus' language about modeling yourself as a slave, and then how do you look at that today? So I've been paying a lot of attention to how contemporary pastors are preaching some of this material. If you have a parable that has to do with slavery, does the pastor go there? Or is that might be a good time to look at the Old Testament reading. We talk about healthcare. Well, how do you talk about a healing miracle in the age of COVID? So I'm trying to figure out what the gospel story, the story of Jesus, is going to get us today. And for me, if we just completely jettison history, then we're just saying the Bible means anything I want it to mean. And I think that's not playing fair with the text. If I want people to care about my own social location or where I'm from or who my people are, then I think we ought to give Jesus that same credit. And that goes back to Jesus within Judaism. what would some of those statements have meant in a first century Jewish context where the go-to text is the Torah, is like Deuteronomy or the prophets like Amos. And then try to put contemporary concerns into conversation. So that's what I've been doing. So I'm actually reading a lot of sermons, which you can find online. And my God, some of them are dreadful. And in a couple of cases,
well, we're sorry.
Yeah, I know that. I mean, not that everything that comes out of a rabbi's mouth is golden either. In a couple of cases, I've actually written to people because I know a lot of clergy saying, I found your sermon of something online, and I'm really surprised that you said this. And I'm getting a lot of very gracious notes back. So I'm not going to like call somebody out. I don't think that's helpful, but I do like the idea of calling somebody in and saying you can make the same point by using different language. And that's why language is so important. It's not only what we say, it's also how we say it.
There's so many sort of flat-footed ways of appealing to the Bible.
Oh, no. You have to be careful because you don't want to marginalize flat-footed people.
Well, I am one, but yes. So many ways to do that. And I mean, the rabbis didn't do that, right? Jewish interpretation isn't literalistic much. Like, oh, it says this and that's it. You know, there's a sense of there's a community of interpretation over time.
Right. Typical rabbinic argument is Rabbi, this says this, Rabbi, this says this. People over here say some third thing. And then you kind of figure out what the majority is. So it's like looking at the Supreme Court. You have the majority statement, you have the minority statement. But since the rabbis don't have the authority to impose any of this on people because they're doing what they think should be happening rather than saying what is happening, Jews themselves have a variety of resources. We're going to go with the minority opinion here because eventually that minority opinion looks better and better. So you've got a variety of ways of understanding stuff. And even to this day, when Jews study Talmud and medieval responsa, we're putting ourselves in dialogue with people who are writing more or less at the time of Jesus and then over 2,000 years. And you continue to work on this in the same way the U.S. legal system has its foundation documents, but then you've got, law after law after law and legal debate. So we do it as part of a community. What the Pharisees were interested in doing, there's a brand new book just out on Pharisees, which I co-edited with Joseph Sievers from the Pontifical Biblical Institute. And the general take now on Pharisees is they're actually the liberalizers, because they know that with some of these really difficult laws, nobody's going to be able to follow them, and nor should anybody follow them, like some of the stuff on death penalty. They're not doing that. So they're trying to figure out how you get around those laws. And they wind up being the liberal ones. And the surprising thing is that in a number of cases, Jesus is taking the more conservative view. For example, on divorce, Jesus says, don't do it. And the rabbis are saying, under certain circumstances, you may need to do this, and let's give you some mechanisms by which you can do that. And at the same time, you protect the rights of both parties.
Fascinating. We will, what's your book? Do you have a title for your book yet?
Oh, the Jesus book that's coming out?
Yeah.
It's tentatively called Jesus for Everybody. They originally wanted to call it Jesus for Atheists. And I said, no, but, believers might have like some of this stuff too.
I'm working on one called Questions God Can't Answer.
Ooh, that sounds good.
It'll be fun.
Can God create a rock that's so heavy God can't lift it?
Yeah, it's more just like you can't call God up. So how do we think about hard questions and so on? Anyway, AJ, as always, a great conversation. We appreciate your time, your wisdom, your wit. It's always great to be with you.
Always fun to talk with you. Thank you for brightening my day.
All right.